This lecture will glance at the long history of atheism, agnosticism, and free thought through the ages. But a few cautions are necessary for the atheist reader. As with free thought in American history, the worldwide history of doubt until the late 1700s has been ignored, suppressed, or denied. The difficulty for the secular reader and the historian is in ascertaining to what extent atheism, in the sense of the word as it is understood in the present day, was prevalent in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. An individual in the Christian tradition who denied the Trinity, but still believing in God or not, could be labeled a heretic or an atheist and be in danger of losing limb or life or both. It was judicious not to let your doubt or disbelief be known. David Berman, the secular scholar, lists several instances in which the existence of early atheism is flatly denied in learned British journals of the 1700s. Berman is convinced that many atheists, fearing to identify themselves as non-believers because of the danger to their lives and property from the Church and Inquisition, developed writing strategies for conveying their atheism and frequently wrote by insinuation. Some well-regarded historians have denied that there was any genuine ability for the minds of men to disbelieve in God before the late 1700s, because religious truth was taken for granted. Such scholars hold that to become atheists, men would have had to have access to the biblical criticism and experimental science of the 19th century. In his erudite 1942 volume about Rabelais and the problem of belief in the 16th century, the distinguished Lucien Febvre combined effective polemic strategies with immense scholarship to claim that there was no early unbelief. His view has had a lingering and non-salutary effect on attempts to write histories of unbelief. It will be important for us to keep in mind, as the lecture moves across centuries of religious doubt, that charges of atheism were made against people who criticized some aspect of religion or government. It is a very difficult task for historians of doubt to tease out which of the thinkers and writers charged with atheism really did not believe in the existence of God, and if so, how the fact could be inferred from studying their published works and statements. In any case, our concerns today will encompass many forms of doubt rather than modern atheism per se, such as non-belief, agnosticism, and deism, among other life stances. James Thrower locates the very beginnings of unbelief in the Ionian region of ancient Greece in the early 6th century BCE. He maintains that in the Greek colony of Miletus, the philosopher Thales and his successors, Anaximander and Anaximenes, began to be concerned with physical nature. They were interested in the question of becoming, or how the world works, its origins, and if there were a primary substance from which all things came. In some instances, the Ionian philosophers' concepts led to a refined theism, but their ideas were also utilized in helping form Democritus's atomistic theories in the 5th century. Many of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers were accused by later generations of atheism or impiety. Some of the names are well known in the history of philosophy, such as Xenophanes, Diogenes, Protagoras, Prodicus, Critias, and Diogenes of Melos. None of these thinkers were atheists or agnostics in the sense of our contemporary usage of the word, which we take to mean no belief in a god or gods or a doubt about their existence. But many of them were critical of the ancient polytheist religion, of both its anthropomorphism and its egregious moral system. Most of them believed in the continuing search for naturalistic explanations for material phenomena. The Socratic period, 5th century BCE Greece, was the age when the conflict between the naturalistic view of the universe and religion became explicit. The old myths began to become under attack by leading playwrights such as Euripides, who seemed to write about certain myths in his dramas only to discredit their falsehoods. The philosophers Socrates and Plato were not atheists, and while they had immense influence on later philosophy, our interest lies in the sophists, who were teachers of the young. They were criticized by Plato, but it is unclear how much of his commentary on them is valid. The sophists were cultural relativists who believed that religion and cultural practices were invented by men. During the same period of 5th century Greece, the interesting figure of Democritus emerges. He was not a sophist, but a man who rejected divinity, either in or outside nature. He conceived nature as an interplay of countless atoms in empty space, ruled by the power of chance, which left no room for teleology and the deification of any moving forces or single primal ground. Democritus believed that man's own inner self-respect would be a sufficient moral force in the absence of a belief in God. He did not believe in the immortality of the soul and conceived of naturalistic causes for religion, such as dreams and the awe man feels in the presence of natural phenomena. Democritus's opinions influenced Epicurus, the Hellenistic Greek founder of the later Epicurean school of philosophy. Aristotle was a philosopher of immense consequence during the 4th century of Greece, but his work was also important to medieval and Renaissance thought in later centuries during the Common Era. Aristotle's thoughts on divinity are closely in alignment with the deism of a later period. James Thrower calls Aristotle's idea of God a concept of an unmoved mover. He maintains that for Aristotle, God was merely a metaphysical postulate. Aristotle was an important influence on the irreligion of the Renaissance, and his practical and worldly philosophy is still embraced by some contemporary ethicists. The Hellenistic period of Greece, which extended from roughly 323 BCE and 146 BCE, gave rise to the philosophies of Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and Skepticism. This period began after the conquests of Alexander the Great, when Greek thought spread across the known world. The Stoics believed in a God, but God was another name for fate or fortune in their conceptual system. The Epicureans claimed to believe in the gods, but their philosophy was concerned primarily with attaining a happy and virtuous life here on earth. Epicureans liberated themselves from the idea of immortality, fear of the gods, of death, and did away with belief in superstitions. The Cynics tried to live life according to nature and were probably practical unbelievers who gave little thought to the existence or non-existence of God. The skeptical school of philosophy can be traced back to the time of Aristotle. Its founder, Pyrrho of Elis, 360 BCE to 270 BCE, was attempting, as were most of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, to find a stance that would provide people with mental tranquility. His ideas were recorded by Timon of Philus. Pyrrho believed that since nothing can be known with certainty, it is important to neither confirm nor deny anything. Sextus Empiricus would take up and refine the Pyrrhic philosophy in 2nd century Rome. Plato's Academy embraced skepticism in its middle period. Carneades, 214 to about 9 BCE, its director, was a skeptic who stated important points concerning religion. Carneades asked if belief in God were really universal, why bother to debate it and risk the chance that it might be disproved? He pointed out that belief by plebiscite does not prove the truth of any concept. Carneades raised many of the objections to arguments for the existence of God that we still use in the present day. He objected to the ontological argument, the argument from design, and raised the problem of evil, which is often convincing evidence of God's existence to many, although there are important theist philosophers such as Alvin Plantinga, who have disputed that such concepts disprove the evidence for God. Ancient Rome was the locus of both traditional polytheist religion and of religions imported from the East, and newer religions such as Christianity. Two important figures with respect to the history of unbelief were Lucretius, the poet-philosopher, and Sextus Empiricus, the physician-philosopher. Lucretius, circa 99 BCE to 55 BCE, was an Epicurean, whose famous poem on the nature of things was a statement of complete atheism. Lucretius believed in the natural laws of the universe and in the abolition of all religion, which he saw as harmful. He maintained that gods did not exist and that life ends in permanent death. He was an important influence on later ideas of atomism and on concepts of humanist morality. Thrower states that Lucretius was the only European author who put a philosophical system, as distinct from a theological one, into poetry. The final important figure with regard to non-belief in ancient Rome was Sextus Empiricus, from the period of the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE. Two titles of his works are the Pyrrhonic Institutes and In Against the Dogmatists. Empiricus saved Pyrrhonic thought from extinction and refined it with his polished style and erudite thought. He maintained that since nothing could be known with certainty, one should neither confirm nor deny anything. Pyrrho had stated the same idea, but Sextus perfected it with his elegant prose. Montaigne and Hume were influenced by him in later centuries, as well as Sir Walter Raleigh. All Greek skepticism, all that was important in the most thorough and consistent development of agnosticism which has appeared in the world, seems to have been preserved in Sextus Empiricus's works. When the last of the pagan philosophical schools was closed by the Christian emperor Justinian in 529 CE, it was the end of the classical age of free thought and doubt. The Platonic and Neoplatonic schools would live on in Christian theology and its vision of reality. In the 11th and 12th centuries CE, Arabian and Jewish translations of Aristotle would emerge to change the direction of Christian thinking and to once again open the way for free thought. James Thrower has made some astute observations concerning Greek and Roman classical thought. He maintains that much of the conceptual framework of free thought that was articulated in the ancient world was repeated again over the centuries, with each resurgence of irreligion, and then finally with explicit or avowed atheism. The first concept that emerged again and again was a naturalistic conception of the world. There was also a flourishing agnosticism accompanied by the moral criticism of religion. There was a growing naturalistic explanation of religion as well, and finally, an emergence of a materialistic view that has come down to the 21st century. Agnosticism and free thought were present in the classical age, and those first stirrings of irreligious thought culminated in later centuries' avowed atheism. There are, of course, many agnostics, pantheists, and deists who embrace free thought in our present day. The Middle Ages, the 12th and 13th centuries CE. The historian David Knowles makes the point that the evolution of medieval thought was very similar to that of the classical period. There was an unexplained explosion of intellectual awakening, the growth of dialectical and speculative philosophy, and near the end of the 14th century CE, the weapons of logic and dialectic were turned against venerable institutions and doctrines. There is one important difference between the two eras, however. The rise of doubt was not hampered as much in the classical world as it was in the Middle Ages, and skeptical thinkers, as a rule, were less persecuted in Greece and Rome. In the Middle Ages, the institutions of church and state continuously attempted to quell speculative thought and free thought. Thinkers were often in peril of their lives for expressing opinions counter to established religious views. The church controlled the universities and had every weapon of suppression in its power to quench unorthodox opinions. The translations of Aristotle by the Arab translator Averroes had considerable influence in the rise of an earthbound humanism when they reached Western Europe in the early part of the Middle Ages. Thinkers began to consider such concepts as matter is in motion perpetual and also eternal. They were exposed to such ideas as there was never any creation in time, that there was one world soul existing in all living things, and that there was no personal immortality. They began to consider whether faith and knowledge must be kept apart. They realized that theology is not a science. In other words, they were dealing with ideas that heralded a modern worldview. In the 13th century CE, St. Thomas of Aquinas was temporarily able to integrate Aristotle's philosophy with Christian thought. He employed a great deal of his formidable intellect to demonstrate that faith and reason were not contradictory, and that such concepts as the existence of God could be proved by natural reason using man's observances of the natural world. However, he also began to develop some distinctions between faith and reason. We now turn to two thinkers in the 14th century who worked very diligently to separate faith and reason. The 14th century was one of upheaval, and the power of papal and imperial authority was waning. Man's faith in speculative reason was also on the decline. Duns Scotus, 1220 to 1308 CE, and William of Aachen, 1300 to 1349 CE, were brilliant theological thinkers who successfully separated faith from reason. Their attempt to save religion with philosophical reasoning was ultimately devastating for its consequences to theology and eventually to religion as well. They not only separated reason from faith, but emphasized that they had a radical lack of confidence in the ability of the mind to transcend the natural world and to establish knowledge of that which lies beyond sensory experience. Theology now rested solely on faith by the end of the 14th century and the dawning of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The Renaissance falls into two movements that are not unconnected. There was an early Renaissance that was aristocratic and classical, with a taste for Greek and Roman art and literature, and nostalgia for what was considered a past golden age. There was a later movement that was much more popular, empirical, less traditional, and more scientific and forward-looking than the earlier Renaissance. George Buckley, a theist proponent, says of the period, aside from the great body of pure literature, most of which had little religious significance, there was in addition a considerable body of works of skeptical and inquiring nature, works which had an agnostic, if not an atheistical import, and which could not be reconciled with the tenets of Christianity. Buckley is writing about doubt in England, but Italy and France experienced the same worldly exposure. Michel de Montaigne, 1533 to 92, wrote his famous essays during the period. He was a Pyrrhonist, or a skeptic, in other words, but he was ever careful of the Inquisition, which confiscated his writings at one point, inspected them, and returned them. Montaigne left the concept of God to the theologians, but essayed into all worldly concerns with an impressive, elegant, and provocative style. Tullio Gregory writes of Caron, who was a friend of Montaigne. Caron published his work De la Sagesse in 1619, and it was pronounced a scandal. Gregory states that it involves the rejection of all claims of dogmatic reasoning and all the values associated with it. Caron maintained that man was not made for truth, but rather his fulfillment is to be found in doubt and ambiguity. The book was a publishing success, going through several printings, even while prelates tried to ban it. Niccolo Machiavelli, or Old Nick, the nickname for the devil, as many people thought of Machiavelli, was another source of unbelief. His volume, The Prince, 1532, with its unashamed realpolitik and cynical view of power and human nature, was blamed by contemporaries for spreading atheism and corruption throughout society. George Buckley even connects Machiavellian thinking to the unbelief of Christopher Marlowe, the Renaissance playwright. The warfare developing among the different religions was another significant source of unbelief. The Socinians elevated reason above all values, but there were other sects vying for predominance, such as the Unitarians, the Family of Love, the Brownists, the Puritans in England, and so on. George Buckley reports on the burnings of Unitarians at Norwich, England, beginning in 1579. Buckley speaks of Pomponazzi, the Italian philosopher, whose writings denied the immortality of the soul and influenced the Paduan school for some 50 years. The Paduan school's ideas were taken up by the French skeptics, but so far it is not possible to be sure of their influence on English unbelief. Davidson writes about the thinker Vanini, who was burned to death at Toulouse for blasphemy and atheism. Davidson states that in one short volume, De Admirandis, 1616, Vanini presented all the alternatives to church thinking that cast doubt on the very existence of God. Davidson believes that atheism in Italy was both conceivable and actual during the period under discussion. If it was not, the presence of free thought was on view and vociferous in speaking its philosophy. The rise of science, 16th and 17th centuries. The scientific discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, and other thinkers and discoverers of the later Renaissance did not influence unbelief as much as the writings and events discussed above. Science was taken up by a later era, the Enlightenment, rather than the Renaissance. Nevertheless, for a great part of the Renaissance, belief and science existed side by side. There existed the doctrine of twofold truth, the truth of faith and the truth of reason, which managed to save superstition as well as permit the natural observations of the world. According to Thrower, three names stand out in this later Renaissance period as significant forces for the transition from belief to science. Descartes, 1596 to 1650, Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and Spinoza, 1632 to 1677. Descartes attempted to defend religion, and at first it seemed his Cartesian philosophy was a valuable support. But with time, a small seed of irreligion, skepticism, became apparent in the philosophy which undermined religion. Many historians affirm that in the last analysis, Cartesian thought reinforced the disposition to accept the scientific world picture rather than the theological one. Hobbes never professed himself an atheist, but his Leviathan, 1651, a volume about the social contract, was highly influential and secular. Hobbes' philosophy was naturalistic and even materialistic. He offered a naturalistic picture of religion and its origin, locating its power in the desire to know and the fear of the unknown. However, he believed that religion was necessary for the good of the commonwealth. He offers a cosmological argument for the existence of God in the Leviathan. Nevertheless, Richard Tuck, a more than competent historian, finds Hobbes effectively an atheist. We have no proof of this claim and must place Hobbes in the ranks of those thinkers enrolled in the school of doubt. The debate concerning whether Spinoza was an atheist or a pantheist continues to the present. But God and nature for him are the same. He is a monist. Once his philosophy is understood, it can be seen that everything belongs to one system, and that system is nature. He maintained that a unique, self-determining, and all-inclusive substance cannot, by definition, be created by anything outside itself. Silvia Berti discusses an impious volume, the Treatise of the Three Impostors, that was published several times during the last 40 years of the 18th century. but it was first published under La Vie et l'Esprit de Spinoza in 1719. The volume contained part of Spinoza's ethics, but once a copy of its first edition was found in the 20th century, it became clear that it was an adaptation of Spinoza. Attacks on Christ and other embellishments were added to it. There are no such attacks in Spinoza's work. The book was influential in the early part of the Enlightenment, but it is not true Spinoza. The later adaptation made Spinoza sound more politically radical, states Berti, and that adaptation was one of the influences on the radical Enlightenment. Pierre Bell, the famous skeptic, said that the champions of reason and the champions of religion were fighting desperately for possession of men's souls, confronting each other in a contest in which the whole of thoughtful Europe was looking on. Our lecture now turns to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. Science during the Enlightenment. Before discussing Enlightenment philosophy, a glance at the sciences and their progress is in order. Despite the gap between the old Ptolemaic systems of geography and astronomy, vast strides were being made in science, physics, geometry, chemistry, manufacturing, and engineering in the last portion of the Renaissance and through the Enlightenment. Exploration and navigation were thriving as well. The Gutenberg press was invented around 1450, and Constantinople fell in 1453. Both events helped disseminate free thought and new thought to people in Western Europe. Some of the first observations were practical. Farmers began to study and observe environmental tendencies that produced the best harvests. Kepler discovered the first law of planetary motion in 1605. In 1609, Galileo invented the first telescope. Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica in 1687. Scientists began to make use of both deductive and inductive reasoning. Descartes combined algebra and geometry. Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, discovered that the sun was the center of the solar system. The Enlightenment, 18th century. The 18th century is the age of reason above all things. Three principles were foremost at that period. The supremacy of the individual and the rights he had as a human being were fundamental to Enlightenment thought. Another important feature was relativism. There began to be a belief that differences in morals, beliefs, and customs between different cultures were acceptable and of interest. The last and most important principle was reason. These three principles were the framework that supported the Enlightenment. Pierre Bell's skeptical ideas continued to be important, and his writings were a consequential influence on Enlightenment thought. His influence waned toward the end of the 18th century, however, as many of his skeptical positions began to be commonplace and part of the zeitgeist. Religion was openly criticized, and contradictions in various religious beliefs were held up to ridicule during the 18th century by some thinkers. Newtonian physics began to replace the Cartesian worldview, both in England and the continent. Geology began to cast doubt on the mechanistic and materialistic universe posited by Descartes. Richard Popkin, the eminent scholar of skepticism, maintains that from the 17th to the 19th centuries, many Jewish anti-Christian arguments in published form had a significant effect concerning the weakening of Christian beliefs. Many Jews had been forced to convert to Christianity, and the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions watched them carefully for any sign of Judaism or Judaist practices. The drive to convert Jews in the 16th and 17th centuries took up more urgency as many Christians revived the belief in the second coming of Christ and the end of days. Sounds familiar. They were certain the second coming had to be preceded by the conversion of the Jewish people. More familiarity. Jews who escaped to the Netherlands and reverted to Judaism had been raised and trained as Christians, reading and studying Christian texts in Christian schools. under Marie de Medici's protection in Paris and safe in the Netherlands as well. They produced arguments against Christianity that were then taken up by deists and incipient atheists, according to Popkin, and used to weaken the dominance of the Catholic Church. George Buckley maintains that large numbers of tracts of unbelief from the continent arrived in England and can be connected to English unbelief. 18th century science maintained a static view of the cosmos. It was believed that the universe began with a single act of creation, and that this act fixed all forms of life in the form in which they had originally appeared. Such a concept of a deity created an unchanging universe was becoming loosened. Voltaire's deism, which accepted such a fixed stance, began to be put aside. There were new ideas, which said that given infinite time, matter and motion would combine to produce all types of phenomena, including the present world. Deists such as Voltaire began to be put on the defensive. The skeptical Philo, a character in Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, 1779, puts naturalistic views forward. The outworn, static view was now being replaced by the concept that life was constant, flux, and change. D'Alembert argued, for instance, that conservation of motion could be explained without the idea of divine intervention. There was a sense in some quarters that God was no longer a necessary factor to account for the world or its workings. The stage was set for avowed atheism. The historian no longer needs to look for incipient and hidden atheism in the perhaps deliberately obscured history of unbelief. Diderot and the Baron de Holbach were self-described atheists, militant and often wrathful against Christianity and the Christian God. Diderot collaborated with D'Alembert to produce that magisterial collection of thought, the Encyclopedia. He wrote The Interpretation of Nature in 1754, in which he discusses how chaos is impossible because of gravity. He revived the Lucretian argument that order found in nature might come out of the innumerable chances that arise out of the manifold motions of its parts from all eternity, having led at length to the present combination. Michael Buckley, the Jesuit who discusses the history of atheism, agnosticism, and unbelief so astutely, has this to say: Diderot stripped Descartes of his theological metaphysics and, insisting on the autonomy of mechanics, restates Lucretius. De Holbach, states James Thrower, is probably the first unequivocally professed atheist in the Western tradition. However, La Mettrie expressed similar views in La Home Machine, 1748. La Mettrie was an atheist as well. De Holbach's attack on religion is devastating and can be found in his book, The System of Nature, 1770. He has three objections to religion. If morality is founded on religion, and religion proves unsound and its foundations collapse, morality might collapse with it. The church supports an unjust social order. Religion is unscientific and supports untruth. Here is Michael Buckley, a Jesuit's view of de Holbach's writings. The System of Nature allows a discussion of the origin of religious beliefs and the validity of theological argument, which will allow de Holbach's work to present a coherent alternative to religious conviction. De Holbach's view of religion's origins is that it is based on fear of the unknown and men's ignorance of natural causes. Nature, not God, is eternal and infinite. Nature is its own end and is complete in itself. Morality will come from man's own sense of self-respect. De Holbach lists the peaceful unbelievers to be found in history: Epicurus, Lucretius, and Hobbes, among others. He notes that it is religious fanaticism that causes violence, not doubt. He states that he writes for a future age, that his views are too advanced for his contemporaries. His optimism for the future is exemplary of the Enlightenment. David Hume The classical skeptic, while never claiming he was a non-believer, might have been a covert atheist. There are many scholars, however, who believe he was a deist. His skeptical impact up to the present day is consequential. Scholars have found that the Philo character in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, 1779, is voicing Hume's own opinions. Philo reviews all the traditional arguments for God's existence in the Dialogues. Many of the same arguments are still in play today. Hume analyzes causality and its relation to the cosmological argument for God's existence. He critiques the teleological argument and the argument from design as well. He is devastating when he attacks the question of miracles. Hume concludes that religion is founded on faith and not reason. He states that religion may not endure if put to the test of reason. The first avowedly atheist book published in Britain was most likely written by a physician, Matthew Turner, and his friend William Hammond. It was titled Answer to Dr. Priestley's Letter to a Philosophical Unbeliever in 1782. Priestley was a Unitarian and the discoverer of oxygen. His home was burned during riots, and he ultimately went into exile to Philadelphia. The answer is a complete statement of complete atheism. Priestley was a theist Unitarian. This book may be the first time a writer has claimed the title atheist. Turner writes, "As to the question whether there is an existent being as an atheist, put that out of all manner of doubt. I do declare upon my honor, I am one." His avowal will become a self-identifying symbol of pride when people begin to describe themselves as atheists or agnostics by the middle of the 20th century. The lecture will now turn to doubt in the 19th and 20th centuries and beyond to the present day. Doubt in the 19th century, the 20th century, and up to the present day. The importance of science vis-a-vis a religion picks up its pace in the 19th and 20th centuries. Before discussing the intellectual and philosophical aspects of unbelief in the modern world, it is important to glance at the scientific discoveries which had serious consequences for religious thought. In 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species was published, and the reverberations from his discovery that species arrive from natural selection are still felt in the 21st century. In 1900, quantum theory was proposed by Planck. Einstein stated the wave-particle duality of light in 1905 and the special theory of relativity. In 1906, Oldham produced evidence that Earth has a core. There were more discoveries in the 20th century, such as the first mapping of a gene to a chromosome, 1910, discovery of the atomic nucleus, 1911, the general theory of relativity, 1915, and a synthesis of genetics with the theory of evolution, 1918. There was the statement of quantum mechanics in 1925. The description of early human species came in 1925, nuclear fission in 1939, radiocarbon dating in 1946, the structure of DNA was described in 1953, and in 1963, the discovery of quasars was announced. In 2001 came the publication of the near-complete sequencing of the human genome. In addition, quantum mechanics demonstrates that the micro world of atoms and electrons behaves differently than the macro world where classical mechanics hold sway. The exact position of an electron in an atom is not known. An important feature of quantum mechanics is uncertainty. Chaos theory applies to systems such as weather that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. This sensitivity is known as the butterfly effect. Such differences in initial conditions yield widely diverging outcomes for chaotic systems, rendering long-term prediction impossible in general. It becomes evident that relativity and uncertainty were the dominant thought processes of the 19th and 20th centuries. Science and philosophical thinking converged concerning doubt, and the impact is felt to the present day. Doubt in the 19th century, the 20th century, and the present day. The 19th century Romantics elevated feeling and individuality above all things. The most famous atheists of the English Romantic poets were Percy Bysshe Shelley, who in 1811 wrote The Necessity of Atheism. He was promptly expelled from Oxford. The most famous religious representative of the time was Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834, who believed God could be found in the religious experience by going within the individual. His approach was never submitted to a robust philosophical examination, according to Thoreau, and the consequences linger to the present. Michael Buckley, the brilliant Jesuit historian, has a different opinion. He maintains that Schleiermacher's approach was very harmful for religion and theology, moving man inside himself rather than outward to Christ. The difficulty was that by putting God into consciousness, such a concept could be dispensed with if a naturalistic explanation for consciousness were found. Feuerbach, the 19th century philosopher, did just what was feared, locating the idea of God as a projection of man who had a sense that he could transform himself in his society, but found it easier to project such sublime ideals to a God. Feuerbach turned religion into anthropology in his Essence of Christianity, 1841. Marx was very influenced by Feuerbach, and he too equated religion with projection and fantasy wish fulfillment. He maintained that religion distracted man from creating a world free of oppression. Here are some of his elegant words on the topic of religion, which he wrote in an 1844 paper on the philosopher Hegel. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for real happiness. Nietzsche was an early existentialist and one of the most important philosophers of atheism in the latter part of the 19th century. Nietzsche was a philosopher who could not only think of the death of God, which he proclaimed, but could also feel its effects. Nietzsche felt the agony, the suffering, and the void later generations would experience as a consequence of unbelief. He could also experience the joy of building something new and creative out of the void. He proclaimed that God is dead and we have killed him, meaning modern man no longer believed in God. In a God's place, Nietzsche wanted to build an entirely new value system. The new values, what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of all values, was to be found by a new breed of men, the overmen, who would transcend the loss of the old, outworn, and worthless values. The new men would create a new society based on courage and joy. Nietzsche attacked Christian moral values in Genealogy of Morals, 1887. Many English intellectuals had little fear concerning the loss of morals when they lost their religion. In 1856, when Sir Stephen Leslie lost his faith, he said, "I believe in nothing, but I do not the less believe in morality, etc., etc. I mean to live and die like a gentleman, if possible." Thomas Huxley, John Stuart Mill, and George Eliot all expressed the same conviction that loss of belief did not make them lose moral rectitude. Charles Bradlaugh was an English example of militant atheism in the 19th century. He was head of the London Secular Party. He was a monist, in other words, a naturalist. He said that atheist was the best word to describe free thought, and repeatedly stated that he believed there was no God. When finally elected to the English Parliament, he was denied his seat and not allowed to affirm his oath. After 6 years, he affirmed and took his seat in 1886. In Parliament, he was responsible for many reforms, another example of many non-believers' sense of responsibility and their moral probity. Walter E. Houghton's seminal volume, The Victorian Frame of Mind, 1830 to 1870, reveals the doubts that assailed the ordinary citizens as well as the intellectual class in 19th century England. Doubt became even more prominent with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. The working class had execrable working and living conditions. Its lack of religiosity was frightening to the bourgeoisie, who feared a revolution similar to the earlier one in France. Darwin was denounced in some quarters for making the foundations of society more vulnerable than they already were with his theory of evolution. The public opinion that wanted more curbs on free thought and expression was the same one that was expressing deep-seated fears. The public was aware of the creeping tide of disbelief that they feared would overwhelm the country. Matthew Arnold's superb poem, Dover Beach, 1867, is an elegant statement of secular agnosticism. The darkening plain Arnold writes of in the poem is the world of wars and confusion that people were faced with. They had no comfort within themselves or without, as many began to lose confidence in a divine order. Dover Beach is a sorrowful and elegiac statement about the loss of belief taking place in the modern world. The 20th century saw the beginning of several philosophies that would help men and women in the endeavor to live with confidence and joy without God, as Nietzsche had tried to encourage in his writings. Existentialism was not without theistic philosophers, but the atheist philosophers of existentialism were the most well-known and read. Jean-Paul Sartre, the most famous and influential existentialist, was a devout atheist, as was the eminent Albert Camus. The problem of God for Sartre was a real one. It involved the loss of meaning in the world, or at least the loss of prescribed meaning. If life had no given significance, Sartre believed man could supply it for himself. It was in making life decisions and moral choices, as well as choosing projects and seeing them through to their conclusion, that created meaning for each person. Camus, as well, found that although life was absurd, one could take up the burden and live creatively and joyously. Sigmund Freud had significant influence in the earlier portion of the 20th century. Freud was a non-believer who attacked religion relentlessly. Freud's Future of an Illusion, 1927, is an explanation of his theory that belief in God is the desire for a magnified Father. Substitute gratification for giving up our primitive instincts and drives came from embracing religion, according to Freud. Religion for him is a form of wish fulfillment. Life is very hard and facing death is difficult to endure. Belief in God places people into a form of regression, a return to the safety of childhood. People receive a sense of security, believing they have a God, the Father, caring for them. A.J. Ayer's logical positivism was another blow to religious faith. Positivists put forward a criterion of meaning for scientific and other language statements known as the verification principle. Thoreau explains that the positivists believed that for a proposition to be meaningful, one should know, in principle at least, how it might be verified or falsified. They found that only sense verification counts as verification that is meaningful. Religious, as well as ethical and aesthetic propositions were, it was claimed, unable to meet this requirement and therefore were dismissed as nonsensical. A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936, which had great success in England and the United States, made clear that the logical positivist school considered religious propositions meaningless. Ayer did not take any position, theist, agnostic, or atheist, for himself, because he maintained none of the stances made any sense at all. His ideas were a telling attack on Christianity and all religion. Although logical positivism is not in vogue any longer, Ayer and his colleagues contributed to weakening of religious dogmatism. As a result of science, psychology, and philosophy's secular conceptualizations, there is a sense in the present day, at least in some intellectual circles, as well as some liberal theological groups, that religion is a choice, a life stance, a perspective rather than truth received by divine inspiration from a supernatural being. Such secular thinking is beginning to be felt beyond the educated classes to the public of the modern world. Once a thought of religion becomes an individual choice rather than a necessity for one's salvation, it is sometimes accompanied by the idea of leaving religion behind altogether. That is what many modern people are doing, finding they can live fulfilling lives in a naturalistic world. Religious belief, of course, remains very strong, particularly in the United States, vis-a-vis the rest of the Western world, with the majority of our population identifying themselves as believers. Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, deserves mention in the discussion of 20th century unbelief. Russell was a brilliant mathematician, philosopher, and social activist during the last century. His essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, 1927, is still in print and consequential for people beginning to search out books on unbelief. It is on the New York Public Library's list of the most influential books of the 20th century. Thoreau states that Russell's atheism is classic, monumental, and based on 19th century premises. He maintains that for Russell, the universe is a brute fact. It just is. Science adequately explains, or will eventually explain, the universe's workings, and nothing more needs to be said. That is Russell's final word on the subject of belief. This lecture's brief glance through the history of unbelief ends here, with religion still strong but being pushed back by every new scientific discovery. The latest object of study is man himself, particularly consciousness and the brain. Many freethinkers believe brain and mind are inseparable, and that thought arises from the physical brain. Neuroscience is in its infancy, as it were, but it is beginning to make breakthroughs concerning how the mind responds to religious language and thought and what is perceived as religious experience. Atheism and its companion agnosticism is surging forward, with new books being written by its proponents and with many free thinkers taking a more activist stance. Books of unbelief by the biologist Richard Dawkins and the philosopher Daniel C. Dennett have had brisk sales and have influenced many people in the direction of non-belief. Books on the history of unbelief need amplification, however. There is as yet no major, comprehensive history of unbelief in the West, although there are excellent histories of atheism in Britain and France and of certain periods when freethinking flourished. There is also no comparative history of atheism or the more general topic of unbelief on the horizon, which is to be regretted in this global world of the present. Jennifer Hecht has written a well-researched and chatty history of doubt, but that is must-reading. But a more comprehensive work is waiting for a future historian. David Wotan has some informative thoughts on the history of unbelief. A great deal of the irreligious past is shrouded in some obfuscation. Wotan does not believe that there were no atheists, as has been claimed, prior to the late 1770s. He is using the word atheist to mean someone who does not believe in the existence of God. He cites 4 excellent reasons to discredit the contention of those who maintain that it was impossible to disbelieve in God before the 18th or 19th centuries. Evidence of unbelief has been found in accounts of trials and autobiographies. The fact that unbelief was punishable by death makes sure we will never know how many unbelievers there actually were. Theologians from the past tell us regularly in their writings that they have disputed with non-believers. Finally, much of the intellectual activity of the late 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, from Montaigne to John Locke, makes no sense at all unless there was a real, not merely fictional, dialogue between belief and non-belief. The dialogue continues today. Whether a definitive answer will be discovered and amplified is a matter for future historians. Thank you for your attention during this long lecture.